Hi, my name is Kate Newcomer, and I am presenting a literature review on stochastic processes and image reconstruction in medical imaging for the OPTI 636 course for fall of 2023. Just a quick overview of topics here. First, I'm going to go over a history of stochastic processes in medical imaging, going from the first X-ray to what we do in the modern day. I'm also going to talk about some current models used, such as Monte Carlo, random walk theory, and the Markov random field method. I'm going to then talk about solving the inverse problem, which is a fun solution to how we can use these stochastic processes in real-world scenarios. And then I'm going to go over some challenges that we see using stochastic imaging processes in real-world scenarios, and then highlight a brief path forward and a conclusion to wrap it all up. So, and just to get a general timeline of stochastic imaging in medicine, in 1896, we had the X-ray developed. This was the first medical imaging technique, and it used a very simple stochastic process, just a ratio of input to output to measure an image of a hand. And then fast forward to the 1948, we have the Rose model, which improved the X-ray image. And then in 1960s, we start seeing Fourier transforms, point spread functions, MTFs. 1972 is when the MRI came out, and this used a lot of those models. And then finally, we go into more modern stochastic imaging processes, such as the Monte Carlo model and things of that nature. So 1896, we have the X-ray. Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen and his team developed the X-ray. You can see him sitting at a table with it here. And the first image is of his hand with a ring on it. So this, at the time, was extremely revolutionary. And it actually used one of the first and simplest stochastic processes, which is simply relating input to output. However, so they used what was called the Hurter and Dürrfeld curve to create an image, which measures density against a log of the exposure. And this is simply just looking at your input versus your output and getting an image from that. However, they didn't really look at noise. So if you go back to the timeline from 1896 all the way to 1948, all they were using was this Hurter and Dürrfeld curve. Dürrfeld. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce his name. But this HD curve was all they were using for many, many years until the almost 1950s. So for 50 years, that's all they used. And then Professor Rose and his team made the discovery of noise and how that impacted imaging processes. And Rose argued that we could drastically improve the quality of our images by looking at the noise in them. So he created what was known as the Rose model, which looked at noise in images and made a place for that. So just back to our timeline, we have the X-ray developed in 1896. We have the Rose model developed in 1948. And after this, well, roughly 10 years later, things started taking off in the stochastic imaging world. So in the 1960s, we have Fourier transforms. In the 1960s, we have Fourier transforms, point spread functions, and MTFs, which were brought to us by the research of Rossman and Doi and their coworkers, who brought to life the idea of signal transfer relationships to the medical community. So for the first time, they were talking about Fourier transforms. This paved the path to give us other types of medical imaging equipment, such as the MRI, um, which was developed in 1972 based off of this research. And then later down the line, we were able to look at more models, such as Monte Carlo effect, random walk theory, and Markov, and now we're able to use those in medical imaging as well. So the main challenge of modern stochastic methods is scatter. So if you're going to be using Monte Carlo or random walk theory, you will have to come to terms with the fact that when you're imaging biological tissue, you will have an extreme amount of scatter. Human skin it varies depending on where on the body you're looking, but it varies from 0.5 millimeters to 4 millimeters in thickness. And this is just one organ. Like there's tons of other things, obviously, that you're going to be looking at in the human body that have some thickness. So if you look at this, all of these stochastic methods are essentially following a photon path length. And when they encounter biological tissue, there are going to be hundreds on hundreds on hundreds of photon path lengths you have to follow to breach that thickness. This means looking at millions on millions of photon interactions to get a picture of what's going on. So therein lies a problem. So before we get into that, let's look more closely at the stochastic methods that are used for medical imaging and that have potential to be used in developing new medical imaging techniques. So one of these is Monte Carlo, which we have learned about. So this I found interesting as like a way to explain it. So you have three different scenarios here. One is the ideal approach, in which you have an input space and a transfer function that are perfectly known and have the same exact response values. This will never happen. And then you have, second, the traditional approach. So the input values are interpolated from sparse data, and the actual transfer function is estimated, which results in estimated response values, and there's no assessment of their uncertainty. And then you have the Monte Carlo approach, which takes into account that uncertainty. So the input uncertainty is modeled by a series of equiprobable input sets, which after processing provide a PDF, a probability distribution function for the response. So this is generally a very good way of looking at this because you need to account for uncertainty, and so you're going to have a probability density function. So this is great. All right. The next stochastic imaging method I'm going to talk about is random walk theory. So random walk is accounting for, so in probability theory, a random walk is a stochastic process in which the change in the random variable is uncorrelated with past changes. So, which means that the photon can walk in a random direction, and it's not relying on its past. It's not relying on the path it took before. So, hence the change in the random variable cannot be forecasted. So in random walk, there is no pattern to the changes in the random variable, as the existence of any pattern would mean that changes can be forecasted. So essentially, this is great for going back to that tissue sample. This is great for what we're looking at here because our photon is going to take a random walk through the sample. It's going to come in through the skin, and then it's going to scatter off of different obstacles in its way, and each way that it scatters cannot be predicted or forecasted. So the random walk theory is actually quite good for medical imaging because it already kind of looks at this um, obstacle in a sense that you would see in the real world. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is Markov random field. Um, so Markov random field is not fantastic for medical imaging because it assumes that there is, well, it doesn't assume there is no noise, but it assumes that, yes, it actually, sorry about that. It does assume that there is no noise. So the Markov random field method is not fantastic for this biological tissue sample because in real world scenarios, you're going to have a ton of noise. So it is interesting though, and it would be interesting to see how we could apply the Markov random field method to a real world scenario. But in any case, there's not been enough research done in this area in looking at some sort of situation where we could actually apply it to the real world, and so we don't have a lot of data on that right now. Anyway, so one thing that all of these methods have in common is that we are using the forward approach to solve them. And the forward approach does not work fantastically for biological samples because there's a lot of scatter. So how do you fix that? How do you look at an image? How do you get an image of something that has a lot of scatter and it's unpredictable and it does not respond in a way that you could possibly predict? So the solution to this is to solve the inverse problem. So I'm just going to walk you through this a little bit. It's from a paper by Simon Arridge. It's called Optical Imaging in Medicine, Modeling and Reconstruction. And this is from 1997, so there has been some work done on that since then, but not a whole lot, surprisingly. So you're given a distribution of light sources. The forward problem, so that we understand what we're working with, is that you're given a distribution of light sources on the boundary of an object, and you're given a distribution of tissue parameters within that boundary, resulting in some measurement set y. So this is typical forward imaging. You have a light source, you have an object, and then you have an image. So y is essentially a Fourier transform of p, which is the distribution of tissue parameters. So, but what if we can't get that? So now we're going to inverse that. So same parameters, but now you're given a distribution of light sources p and a distribution of measurements y on some boundary. Derive the tissue parameter. So we look at the tissue parameter based on the inverse Fourier transform of the distribution of measurements. And this allows us to get past the problem of having extreme amounts of scatter in a material. So there are some challenges at play here, because even with the stochastic models that we have, the Monte Carlo, the random walk, that are viable, and even with solving the inverse problem, we're still going to have a lot of issues if we use any of these for medical imaging. So the first issue is the intensity matching problem. So in real world scenarios, there is an inherent unreliability of absolute intensity measurements due to fluctuations in power source or other issues with coupling. So the question remains, like, how do we get rid of that? And then you also have the boundary effect problem, which comes from the fact that most models rely on precise green functions, and these are not found in nature. Then we have the 2D versus 3D problem. So most models are developed in 2D scenarios, and the applications, such as medical imaging, are 3D problems. And then the last obvious challenge using the inverse model is the initial estimate problem. So, for example, if one is imaging a homogeneous region with an irregular boundary, it is very hard to have a reference material. And it's important to look at how we get an initial estimate in this case. So, one thing that each of these models have in common is that they are largely performed in the simulation space, and there are very few tests that actually look at using Monte Carlo, Markov random fields, and random walk theory in real world scenarios. And so these are the things that you run into when you apply them to real world scenarios. How do you match that intensity? How do you work with that boundary effect problem? How do you even switch something from 2D to 3D? It's interesting to think about, but what really needs to happen to solve each of these issues is to have more testing in these areas. Because without more real world testing, there's no way that we can get the data that we need to make the changes to this. So, path forward, as I just said, the main challenge is addressing how we use these models in the real world in imperfect scenarios. And much more testing needs to be done before we can utilize the full capabilities of stochastic methods in medical imaging. So, in conclusion, medical imaging has come a long way from the first X-ray. So, first we had the X-ray with that dealt mainly with just an input to output ratio with the HD curve. And then 50 years later, the Rose model was created to give us a way to track signal to noise ratio in that and improve the image. And then that paved the way for us to look into different ways of interpreting images using Fourier transforms and MTFs and PDFs. And then after that, we got into more of the, we were able to do more with medical imaging. We were able to have MRIs and CT scans. And after that, now we're looking finally at using very delicate stochastic methods to improve our medical imaging quality. And these stochastic methods, such as Monte Carlo, random walk theory, and Markov random field theory, can be very useful if we use the inverse problem to improve the quality of scatter. And also, we need to do a lot of testing in the real world to create more data around this and find solutions to the issues that we're seeing. So overall, stochastic methods provide great potential to improve medical imaging techniques, and I am very excited to see where they go in the future. Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for giving me this opportunity, and also thanks to the College of Optical Sciences for this course. And here are all of my acknowledgments and references. Thank you very much. And stop. Thank you.